none, we'll call on Glenn Michalchuk to present.
Thank you. Let me just briefly explain who I represent. I am the national president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians. Our national office is located here in Winnipeg and is adjacent to the Ukrainian Labor Temple, which is a national historic site. The AUUC is the oldest mass secular organization of Ukrainians who came to Canada to start a new life. It has existed for 100 years and throughout has represented the strivings of Ukrainian Canadians, both settled and newcomers. The first of the labor temples to be built as part of our organization was the Labor Temple in Welland. I would like to thank Mayor and Council for the opportunity to speak tonight on this important issue. Ending the war in Ukraine is of paramount importance. The conflict threatens peace in Europe. Escalation of the conflict threatens world peace and security. Canadians have been impacted by the conflict. Ukraine has been devastated by the conflict. Millions have fled the country. Thousands have died or been injured. The country's infrastructure and environment have been damaged, and it will take billions of dollars to repair this. This war, its destruction, and the collateral damage to the world economy and supply of food could have been averted. Before the outbreak of this war, the AUUC called for diplomacy and negotiations for peace. Our position was not unique to the AUUC. It was widespread sentiment amongst Canadians. It was the position of the people in Ukraine. Once the war broke out, we called for its resolution through diplomacy and peace negotiations. Again, this was not a position unique to our organization. A framework for peace existed in the Minsk agreements, signed by Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, and ratified by the UN Security Council. We have since learned that averting this war was not in the cards. On February 24th, war broke out, much larger than the civil war that waged in eastern Ukraine since 2014. There was a possibility to stop it. We know the peace talks of April 2022 between Russia and Ukraine were scuttled. We have now had 10 months of war that was preventable. The resolution before Council tonight is not a resolution which will bring the conflict any closer to being resolved. Weapons have fueled this conflict. The desire to maintain the flow of weapons has escalated the conflict. In the resolution before you, it specifically calls for continued military assistance. Canada would do better to call for resolution of the conflict by supporting the majority of nations who want the conflict to end. Instead of fueling the war, Canada should support the diplomatic initiatives to bring the warring parties to agree to a ceasefire, negotiations for settlement of the issues that underlie this war, and the achievement of a peace agreement. Peace and diplomacy is distinctly lacking in the Canadian government actions in response to this war. Increasing numbers of Canadians believe this is what needs to be done. It would be of significance if the St. Catharines City Council did likewise, supporting peace initiatives instead of military initiatives as the means to end this war. If we are to avert more destruction to Ukraine and the danger of this war escalating to the possibility of conflict between NATO and Russia, then we must all support the initiatives that are underway to end the conflict. Internationally, these initiatives are led by Turkey, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and of course, the United Nations. We know that the president of Ukraine has responded positively to the China initiative released on Friday. We know that Russia has also indicated its willingness to enter peace negotiations. The world may be at a moment like that in April of last year when there was a real possibility to end the war. This moment should not be lost, but I fear that may be the case. I have watched events in Ukraine very closely, both before and after the Russian invasion of February 24th. The people of Ukraine wanted peace after 8 years of civil war. President Zelensky was elected on a platform of peace, but was prevented by opposition forces in Ukraine which did not want peace. At this critical moment, we hear the call for escalation through more weapons. Canada can play a critical role in changing what is happening, but it needs to change what it is doing. Canada must emphasize the need to bring peace to Ukraine and act accordingly. The strategy of more weapons to support more war has been a failure. In conclusion, I urge councillors to take a stand which will push forward ending this war and securing peace. I've spoken many times on this. I have said that the war could have been averted but was not, and once it started, could be stopped. The policy of weapons and war has been disastrous. I thank you for your time.
All right. Councillor Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to, I guess, the presenter. To make it clear, we certainly all want peace in this conflict. And I guess the concern here is the part in the motion that provides military support during this time. I guess my question would be, without the military support, how would Ukraine be able to defend themselves without having that support?
Well, I take you back to what I said in my remarks. In April 2022, there was a definite peace plan on the table between Russia and Ukraine. Once that was scuttled, it's this never-ending cycle of weapons and war and weapons and war. But there's significant diplomatic initiatives underway. And the question is, if those initiatives are going to be successful, then a country like Canada, if it steps up and assists those initiatives, can make that change.
Thank you for that.
Otherwise, you're locked into an endless cycle of more weapons, more war. And I think, as been said by the first speaker, Salah, that there's no guarantee that this is going to bring any different outcome. But if there's a concerted effort to ask for peace and negotiations by world powers and middle powers such as Canada, that is certainly going to change the narrative of what's going on.
Thank you, Mr. Michalchuk. And I'll also acknowledge you for your work that you've been doing out in Winnipeg with the Walk for Peace and calling on peace of both nations. So thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions? Councillor Miller.
Yeah, thank you. I guess similar question to what I asked, and I don't expect you to represent all Ukrainian Canadians, but do you have a feeling that there's a consensus or a majority of what Ukrainian Canadians want in order to resolve this conflict, or how this conflict could be resolved in this, and something that we could meaningfully support or advocate for?
I think it's very hard for anyone to say they know what a consensus of what all Ukrainian Canadians think about the question. But like I said in my remarks, I've been following this war very closely before and since the war broke out. Here's what I understand about what Canadians of Ukrainian descent, whether they're second or third generation. I'm third generation myself, or even those who are newcomers. I do think that I can say with some confidence that Ukrainians want peace. Now, whether I can say that's a majority or not, I haven't been able to poll Ukrainians to that extent. Why do I say that? Because when the war first broke out, there were large rallies of Ukrainian Canadians. And I would go to those rallies and I would listen to the news reports, because the news people interviewed participants there. And it was very interesting when you listen to the news reports or when you talk to people. The ordinary people what was their concern? Their concern was what is happening to their family back home. What is happening? Will the war get bigger? I mean, I'm talking about in the first weeks of the war. And then when you heard, say, representatives who were there from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, they presented the Ukrainian Canadian Congress position on the war. And at the beginning of the war, it was they would advocate for no-fly zones, they would advocate for more weapons, and so on. So that's one thing that I've noticed, is there's this kind of break between what ordinary people say and what maybe some organizations that have an agenda around the war to present. I do know, and I have been in touch with ordinary Ukrainians of relatively newcomers to Canada, and they have come from various parts, such as Eastern Ukraine. We have to remember that Eastern Ukraine is a Ukrainian population that has been the target of 8 years of civil war. So I do think that Ukrainians desire peace. As I said, Zelensky was elected on a platform of peace, amongst other things of his platform, which was dealing with corruption and so on in Ukraine. So I think there is a genuine sentiment for peace amongst Ukrainian Canadians and amongst the people of Ukraine and people of Ukraine.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Williamson, followed by Councillor Kushner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through to the presenter. I am no war hawk, but Vladimir Putin is the aggressor in this situation, and he really doesn't seem to be willing to respond to diplomacy or overtures of peace. And we've seen this in history. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies and show them that you're going to be willing to apply some force. How would you? And Churchill said, "It's better to jaw than it is to war." But when time came, he was willing to take on the aggressors. How would you respond to the fact that Vladimir Putin is not necessarily a rational decision maker and may not respond to overtures of peace in a diplomatic way? Thank you.
Well, we know that's not even borne out by the facts, what you say. I mean, there was negotiations between Ukraine and Russia for a peace deal in April 2022. You may not choose to believe the reports that have come from people who were actually part of those negotiations, including, I think it was the former president of Israel, who documented how that deal was broken apart by the actions of the United States and the United Kingdom. There was an actual peace deal on the table. There was the Minsk agreements on the table before the war broke out. So there's no evidence to suggest that peace was not possible in Ukraine or that Russia was interested in anything other than resolution of, first of all, the civil war in Ukraine through the Minsk agreements, and now this war. I mean, you have major powers such as China and India who also have contact with Russia and its leadership. And they believe that a peace agreement can be reached.
All right. Councillor Kushner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, everyone wants peace. I'm of Ukrainian descent, and the Ukrainians I talk to certainly want peace. They don't want war. My parents came to this country because of war in the Ukraine, and they advocated for peace. But at the same time, you have to step up to a bully. Now, if you want to advocate for peace, why are you not advocating for the Russians to pull out of Ukraine? That would be a good step for proper negotiations, because you can't negotiate with somebody who's invaded your country and is slaughtering the people, slaughtering the cultural icons, and slaughtering the infrastructure. It's not even. And if you want to negotiate, you have to have two even parties. And right now, there are not two even parties. One is being slaughtered by an invader. And therefore, I would suggest that you propose to the Russians that they withdraw from the country, and if they did, I'm sure there would be a negotiated peace very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other questions? All right.
I could respond to that. I could respond to that if I might.
No, that's okay. We'll move on to